From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Where is the global economy headed? It's anyone's guess. And the latest report from the International Monetary Fund may offer some clue. The International Monetary Fund said on Monday that it now expects the global economy to grow from 3.4% in 2022 to 2.9% in 2023. That is up from a forecast of 2.7% in October. China's reopening was cited as cause for optimism, and the IMF projects that China and India will together account for half of the global growth. Meanwhile, in the United States, the Federal Reserve has once again raised its interest rate in an effort to curb inflation. How will these dynamics play out in shaping the global economy in 2023? Let's talk to our panelists. Liu Baocheng is Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. And also here with me is Atul Dalakoti, Executive Director at the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, joining us from Xiamen. And also in Beijing, we have Emmanuel Daniel, Chairman at TAB Global and author of The Great Transition, The Personalization of Finance, is here. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's look at some key data, forecasts from the IMF outlook. It says the global economy will grow. Actually, the growth rate will go down from 3.4% to 2.9%. The US is down to 1.4%, and the UK is expected to a whopping drop to minus 0.6%, but emerging and developing Asia is on an upward trajectory, with China growing to 5.2%. Of course, that is a forecast, that is a poll. Emmanuel, why do you think we have this disparity between Europe and Asia and between developed and developing economies?
Well, the thing about this IMF report, which is done twice a year, is that it's a snapshot of a period in time. So that's what conditions look like right now. And the numbers that you've just cited, a lot of it has to do with China's reopening in January. This dichotomy between developed and developing countries, if I were to put it down to one most important factor, is the cost of credit. I think that in a lot of the developed countries, the cost of credit has skyrocketed, and there's a lag time for the developing countries for the cost of credit to affect these countries. And then, of course, there is the excess liquidity that is in the European and the developed economies, which is still working its way through. So inflation is very high, and a lot of the regulators and the central banks in the developed countries are still battling inflation.
Yeah, Atul, what do you make of the IMF forecasts and projections? The forecast mentioned and singled out China and India, which will account for over half of the global growth.
Well, China-India bilateral trade, has seen very rapid growth. The trade, which used to be less than $1 billion in 2000, today stands at more than $136 billion. Yes, the trade deficit that India has with China is not sustainable, and we need to find ways and means to address this issue. For that, we need the officials of both the countries to sit together and work out the modalities. I feel there are many areas where these two countries, with a combined population of over 2.8 billion people, can cooperate, like pharmaceuticals, agricultural products, alternate medicine, wellness, and service trade. I also strongly feel that India should try to increase the penetration in the China market of its high-end products. Chinese consumers are quite open in their outlook for accepting top-quality products, and cosmetics comes to my mind. I remember one of the soaps from India became a bestseller in China in the early 90s, and I'm sure there are good products from India that we can bring to the China market. With the big changes due to artificial intelligence, big data, Internet of Things, augmented reality, and autonomous vehicles, we are going to see India-China work together in the areas of shared economy, leading to a lot of opportunities in the service trade. Wang Guan.
Yeah, you're right, Atul. The trade deficit between our two countries actually crossed the 100 billion mark, 100 billion US dollars, of course, for the first time ever as Indian exports to China dropped. What do you think accounted for that?
I think there's a huge demand in India because India is also growing very quickly. And I think one of the major areas of exports from China is the handheld devices, because India is now a country with more than 1 billion connected people. So even the people who are doing agriculture are now depending on handheld devices to get information about the weather, the costs of seeds and everything. So I think as India grows, as a 1.4 billion people grow, they require a lot of things. And that's the reason why we have much more exports from China to India. But as I said in my previous remark, this is not sustainable. We need to bridge this gap. And that's why it's important to diversify the export portfolio from India.
Well, I think the one strategic solution is that India can be more open for Chinese investment because, for example, Huawei and Xiaomi, etc., they are investing a lot, and there is also China Industrial Park that is being proposed. But what is required is that India needs to streamline its investment policy to give more predictability to those investors. So in this way, we can really make more mobile phones, for example, locally, and then re-export not only to China but also to the rest of the world. That is a strategic solution to balance the trade.
Atul, it seems like you disagree.
I really don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Atul. I'll give it some time to respond.
I really don't agree that these two things are connected. Investment is a very important area, and we need to work on that. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, the trade has to be balanced. So we need to import, China needs to import more from India. And that's why let's not try to put these two things together. The investment part is very, very important because these two countries, which are neighbors, need to invest in each other's countries. And we need to have similar policies where Indian investment should be equally welcome to come to China and Chinese investments could be equally welcome to come to India. But let's not try to dilute the fact that the trade deficit is one of the major issues that we need to address.
Well, actually, if you look at the Chinese experience, and over the past more than 4 decades, China really attracts more of the foreign investment from the United States, from Europe, and that really strengthened China's exporting power because it does not only bring capital, but also technology and working expertise, etc. And by having, increasing by having the quality increase and also the offering the export channels, more made in China can really be exported, and that is there to support China's increasing the trade surplus. I think this type of practice can also be considered for many other developing countries where they can attract investment to mitigate the gap of investment deficit and also to train the local capacity, and then to promote the export drive to earn more foreign exchange and then balance the trade.
I think we can agree on one thing, gentlemen, that is there's great potential, there's great room for China-India trade and investment relations to grow. I hope this show can focus more on China-India relations, and unfortunately we have so many countries and regions and sectors to focus on. Professor Liu, can I pick your mind on the IMF forecast on the Chinese economy, 5.2%? Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on that projection?
Well, that's very much a renewed optimistic forecast because in last October, China was still maintaining the zero COVID policy, and there was no expectation that China could really lift the ban. so quickly. So therefore, by lifting the tight control, more productivity can be resumed and more social mobility can be enhanced, and particularly the service sector will be invigorated. So therefore, there's a good reason for them to raise their expectation over Chinese growth. And the other is that because China is heavily reliant on the import of many of the raw materials and energy, etc., now that the energy price at least is getting more and more stabilized, and that is something that can help China to build more resilience in its economy. And more importantly, I think the Chinese Economic Work Conference by the central government really gave more of the confidence to all investors, not only domestically but also internationally, for the Chinese market.
Yeah, Emmanuel, you have been living in China for quite a while. This projection, 5.2% by the IMF, what's your take on that?
Well, it's a re-rating, taking into consideration the opening up of China. But what the IMF didn't say very much in its report, it's what its outlook is going forward. And I think that they've taken into consideration the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is rising US interest rates. It's affecting everybody around the world. And that's why, although there's cautious optimism, there's a cautiousness in the report that all of the dividends from China opening up will be absorbed in the first quarter, and then we get to deal with some of the real issues in the next 2 quarters coming up. And I think that we need to spend some time thinking about what the outlook will be like going forward. In fact, just reading the report, and by the way, Citibank is even more sanguine than the IMF. I think it forecasts a growth of 5.7% rather than 5.2%. So that's the investment banks seem to be a lot more hopeful about China than the IMF itself. The IMF has been very, cautious in its outlook. But going forward, I think we have to be concerned about the possibility of a credit event happening in the next 2 quarters. These are events where either large corporations or countries, whether it's in this part of the world, Southeast Asia is especially vulnerable, where corporations are unable to meet their debt commitments because the dollar rates are very high. I think that's the elephant in the room, the unspoken problem that is as endemic as the opening up as China.
Yeah, definitely, Emmanuel. Seizing upon that point, the elephant in the room, the U.S. Federal Reserve a few hours ago just raised its benchmark interest rate by a 1/4 percentage point, which is widely expected. And also it gave little indication that it is nearing the end of its rate hike cycle. What do you make of that?
Well, Powell said that that will continue for a while, and I think the U.S. markets have absorbed the rate hikes, expectations for the next 2 quarters. It will result in credit events in the U.S. In the next 2 quarters for sure, meaning that there is an upside ceiling to the productivity gains and the ability of large corporations in the U.S. to absorb credit costs at this point. So I think that we need to be cautious that there is no end in sight yet on the Federal Reserve Bank's battle against inflation. And as it turns out, the country that suffers most from the Federal Reserve Bank, surprisingly, is the UK. Because the UK's own credit costs, has hit the ceiling, and the country has to balance its budget. So there are concerns about taxation, being introduced, and so on. So there are countries unexpected countries that are being affected by the rise of the U.S. rates. In Southeast Asia, in China, we are all trading countries, and export the export potential and the ability to import high industrial goods at reasonable rates. These are the issues that confront developing countries or countries that are still growing their trade capabilities.
Yeah, Atul, talking about the ripple effect of the Fed's rate hike, how do you expect that decision to affect developing economies, especially those in China and in India?
Well, I see that in the past 3 years, there has been a lot of savings in both India and China because of COVID, and the consumers are coming out with all guns blazing in a sense. And we saw that during the Chinese New Year when the box office collection was over $900 million. It's quite amazing and a clear indication that consumption is finally catching up after this COVID, especially the COVID wave in China. As an Indian, I always would love to see more movies coming from India into Chinese screens. But I think the Chinese consumer is coming to age now. So as we get out of into an area of post-COVID, we are going to see that a lot of consumption is going to take over, and we'll have travel coming back. We'll have investments coming back. So the whole process will move forward. The increase in interest rates in the US, of course, does have a clear effect on the Indian rupee because interest rates keep going up. In the US, they put a lot of pressure on India and on China. But I think the overall environment today is such that a small interest rate increase in the US does not really put a very big burden on Indian and Chinese economies to grow. So I'm very positive that as the projections are, that the year 2023 is going to be a good year for the Indian and Chinese economy.
Yeah, Professor Liu, Atul just mentioned the Chinese consumer market, the box office revenues, travel bookings. Some economists that I've talked to believe that those numbers are probably not statistically significant to substantiate the assertion that the Chinese economy, the consumer market, is rebounding for sure. What do you think?
I think it's a provisional rebounding, and there is a revenge consumption syndrome that is there because after you are locked down for a long time, and then you just wanted to play out in the open places, etc. But after the shock wave of widespread infection, we do see that there is more stabilized confidence for the Chinese economy, and we can see that the coffee shops, restaurants are filling with more people, and shopping malls are getting reopened, and we can see that the travel is really getting more and more normalized, and the traffic jam is also returning. So this way is more of getting more rationalized type of consumption pattern that is there to be more stable. So from friend circles, we can see that they are making travel plans, and not only for the Spring Festival, but also for the entire year. So therefore, we can see that the hardest hit service sector is going to revive. And then with the more of the confidence injected through the economic conference, putting on the further emphasis on the economic growth. So the real estate sector is going to see some type of recovery, and then productivity in many of those export-driven factories are really resuming.
Yeah. Talking about the world economy, ASEAN is a major player. It's one of the largest trading partners of China. Emmanuel, the IMF has forecast that there will be a downward projection for the ASEAN's economy. Why do you think that is the case?
Wang Guan, can I just add to that
Sure.
comment on consumption in China? Overconsumption, the numbers showed up during the Lunar New Year. but substantial consumption, car sales and mortgages, home sales are still very soft in China. And I think that that's a function of inflation and consumer confidence going forward. I think that this is a great time for China to rein in its own inflationary trends and win back consumption on home mortgages and on car sales, for example. That's a much more substantive leading indicator for consumer confidence. Now, coming back to Southeast Asia, many of the Southeast Asian countries are export-driven, and their corporates are exposed to dollar debt. The macroeconomics is very forex or foreign exchange sensitive. So these are three factors that that causes, and all three of them are directly related to dollar rates. In fact, just about every Southeast Asian country is fighting against the rise in the dollar rate at the moment, exchange rate against the dollar. And I think that as they adjust their economies, what I've seen is that in a number of them, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and in the Philippines, debt to GDP ratios are still among the best in the world, actually. But even if they are below 100%, they are still exposed to the cost of credit, and I think that's what's affecting the softness of the Southeast Asian markets.
Well, thanks for highlighting those uncertainties. Atul, as the executive director of the Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry here, a major risk is, of course, public health emergencies and the public health-induced policy uncertainties here in China. I'm sure you have seen one thing or two about that in the past 3 years. There are talks about the future waves of COVID and subvariants of Omicron. You've been living in China for many years. How serious, how real do you think those dangers are?
The last wave of COVID in China was a big one, and it seems to have passed away. We were very fearful that during the Chinese New Year, we'll see many more COVID patients, but that did not happen, which is a very welcome sign. We certainly need to be careful about the new variants coming back, and pandemic prevention and vaccination seems to be the only way forward. Therefore, it's very important for the media also to spread the important message of erring on the side of caution in the future. So 2023 still could throw a few surprises our way. So we need to get the economy going, help increase consumption, increase travel, have more foreign trade and investments, but at the same time, still maintain a cautious outlook. That's the way I look at the present situation. Wang Guan.
Yeah, to what areas do you see the potentially having the most robust growth? Coming from India to China, commercial-wise or investment-wise, in the year 2023.
So for 2023, the areas which I see a lot of possibility is in the area of pharmaceuticals, and I am very much of the belief that the service trade has immense potential. India is an IT hub today for the international businesses, and we are also doing a lot of services for those international businesses in China. We hope that in 2023, we can work more with Chinese companies, not only for their international businesses, but also for their businesses in China. And I personally wish that India and China can become champions of globalization and work together to create a new world order, which is based on the principles of equality and encourage resource sharing and interconnected development. I think that is where we need to take this economy of both India and China, 2.8 billion people, two biggest engines of growth in the world. That is the way I look at it.
Yeah, that is also the wish of many emerging economies, to have a multipolar world economy. Professor Liu, you recently co-authored a book called Revolution in the Global Economy, It's nominated for a number of global economic awards. Can you tell us a bit about the main findings of your book?
I think one finding is really to challenge the classic and neoclassic economics where they hold many of those conditions constant, which are really changing in fact. So, and we are also challenging the Fukuyama's, the end of a history, or, Friedman's, the world is getting flat. Actually, the world is getting more rugged, and the history is never end. And there is more inclusivity, and there's more diversity in terms of political governance, in terms of the geopolitics, and in terms of the growth model, in which China is also, under the spotlight for its own unique way of growing its economy, of managing its own country. And the other point is that past dependence will cause diminishing return. So therefore, actually, if you look at many of the crises that we are facing, many of those decision-making are really made as a matter of expediency instead of a long-term integrity. And so the politicians respond, too dramatically to some of their constituencies in order to win popularity, and then they lose sight of the long-term growth and long-term sustainability. So I think this is really there to remind the key decision makers, to have a more rational calculation and to look at the complexity and the diversity of the whole world situation.
Yeah, political expediency over economic rationality. We've seen that again and again and again. Emmanuel, we have 2 more minutes left. I want to pick your mind on the fallout of the war in Ukraine on the world economy, because we've seen many countries suffer, many sectors are suffering. For example, recently I've talked to some enterprises in northern China and they're running out of corn. Why? Because Ukraine was the major supplier of corn, 95% of them. And now Ukraine stopped exporting corn to China.
Well, I've traveled to probably 20 countries in the last 6 months, and the thing that hit me dramatically in the face, almost, was the rise in food prices in a number of countries, especially destitute ones, and the recalibration of the availability of gas. In a number of countries, I actually had situations where the gas stations had run out of gas. So, so the repercussions are real. At the same time, on the macroeconomic front, I think what the IMF has done in its report, by the way, is that it's actually recalibrated the actual global impact or economic impact. If you notice in this January report that it re-rated Russia as being able to grow its GDP from a negative rate to 0.1 or something like that. I think it's 0.1. And 0.3, and that's interesting. What it's saying in the report then is that the oil inventories are being accounted for globally. Even the growth in Europe has been re-rated because gas prices are not as high, have been re-rated in that sense. So what's interesting, in a subtle way from the Ukraine crisis, is that a new world order is arising. The countries that are benefiting from this crisis are not the usual suspects. In fact,
Emmanuel, that's all the time we have, I'm afraid. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you so much. Come back again, please.
Okay, take care.
And thank you for watching this episode of The Hub on CGTN. Our news coverage continues. Bye and take care.